Jordan, can I put it slightly differently, though?
Please, I'm begging you. Yes, I was going to say, I can't wait till Osginus comments on this.
Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. Now that's an interesting passage, and Dr. Blackwood will elaborate on this. The word phenomenon is etymologically derived from the Greek word phanesthai, and that means to shine forth. And that's a concept worth considering, because you'll note, if you look at how you attend to the world, that some things attract your attention, they beckon to you. Sometimes that's because you can voluntarily find things meaningful, so you're imposing a structure on the world, but sometimes it's as if the world is calling to you, it's pulling your attention hither and yon. And Dr. Blackwood, you had some interesting comments about what happens with Moses next. And Moses looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside, so he deviates from his pathway, and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned.
Well, and it goes on to say, and when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, I was just when we were talking last night, I was thinking about, what are the conditions under which this revelation happens, and what are the conditions under which it happens in our own life, this opening up to the transcendent. And it seems to me there's something very important here in which, Moses is attending to something. And it's like Aristotle says, philosophy begins in wonder. Mm-hmm. There's this very beautiful moment in which Moses turns aside from where he is to go and attend, and that it's only because he's open to the possibility of turning aside that he sees the burning bush, and the revelation that is in that is able to unfold in his life.
So he's engaged in some sense in an instrumental activity, right? He's about his own business, but he's open enough to what isn't within his framework of reference, let's say, to note when something is significant that calls to him, and then humble enough to pay attention to it, and that's where he encounters God.
Also, could I just say there's a sense, he says, to take off your shoes because the ground on which you're standing is holy. I mean, there's this real question of, is everything holy ground? I mean, it's not the world that changes, right? It's our own perception of the world that changes. And, I
don't know what he's going to say next. Everything, it's not our perception. It is the fact that God is there that makes it holy ground. It is the fact that God is there. And therefore, the land that Moses is standing on is holy ground. Surprised that he would miss that. And there's a couple of criticisms immediately from my mind when it comes to this. Is they're just completely ignoring the historical nature of this thing. Like, this is the thing that actually happened. And my criticism last time was the same thing, is that immediately jumping into this psychoanalysis of how we view the world and what happened. Like, there's a dude named Moses that has an experience with the burning bush, and God calls out to him and sets him to task. We can't miss that and then immediately start speaking about our experience of the world. So you just cannot do that.
I would say there is no moment in life that isn't in itself actually holy. It's a matter of coming to be open to, or it to be revealed as holy in your life. No, there's no moment that cannot be redeemed or made epiphanic, whether it's doing the dishes or, doing the laundry or picking up the usual things of any day, or the usual toils and tribulations of normal life. There's no moment that doesn't have in it the possibility of divine revelation. And so it's
your shoes are off.
Yes. If have the spiritual, let's say.
This is, guys, as students of the Bible, this is quite a bit of eisegesis. They're not studying the text for what the text says. It's like, why ignore it? It just makes no sense to me.
I read in Jung years ago this idea that I found extraordinarily compelling and useful, which was that every ideal is simultaneously and necessarily a judge. And so you imagine that the ideal is something that beckons to you, but you also pale in comparison to the ideal. And so by apprehending an ideal, you're also simultaneously judged. And the higher the ideal, the more intense the judgment in some real sense. I think that's partly why people are terrified of great art, like Michelangelo's David. I read a great commentary on that. The commentator suggested that the statue calls upon you to be far more than you are. So there's that judgment. And I think part of what happens to Moses here is that he's afraid to look upon God, the God of Abraham that calls people to adventure, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God that calls people to adventure.
So for me, I would not immediately go there. I would immediately look at the idea that God is introducing himself to to Moses as the God who had called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's a historical narrative that is set into place, that I'm the same God who called you, your people, because being the God of Abraham means, hey, I made promises to Abraham that hasn't come to pass yet, predominantly having their own land, right? Like that, he's going to give them this land, because the whole narrative is going to move in a direction where they're going to inherit the land of Canaan, because this scripture is going to be followed upon with, hey, the time has been fulfilled. What I told them about this 400-year kind of not inheriting the land yet till the time of these Canaanites and their rebellion against God has been fulfilled, for the land to spit them out, for God to kick them out of the land. It's been fulfilled now. And now you guys can go into the land. So I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is a regular thing that gets referred to because this is Yahweh. He's identified as their God, as opposed to other gods who are the gods of other people. And I think the reason why Moses is not or is afraid to look upon God and stuff like that is a continuous narrative that nobody looks upon the face of God and lives. As that God is so holy, so divine, so pure that human beings aren't that, and so therefore there's a great deal of kind of fear and respect and reverence that comes into that conversation. I wouldn't just again immediately go as like, oh, this is the ideal.
And sacrifice and then out of slavery as well is that ideal that's ultimately terrifying in some real sense. And so Moses hides his face, for he was afraid to look upon God.
Their negotiation is interesting to me, because God sort of comes forth here and lists his bona fides, right? Because he says, I'm your God, I'm the God of your people. Mm-hmm. And so it's very interesting, the back and forth between him and Moses. And so, he's almost proving the case that he's the God to be set before other gods, by identifying him as the God of his people.
And certainly the God to be set before other gods by Moses, given his cultural heritage, right? So I'm not only God, I'm not only this transcendent figure that you would assume might be behind the unconsumed burning bush, but the more particularized God that's already been identified as part of this tradition, right?
And based on what Stephen was saying, Moses' reaction to God's call is also one of attention. He says, here I am. That's all he can do. He can just, I'm here and I'm paying attention to what is happening. And this phrase is so important that it's repeated in other places in the Bible. You see it in the story of Samuel, for example, who has that same reaction. He hears the call and all he can say is, I am here and I am attending now. And so it's interesting to see that this idea of attention continues on in the story as well.
It's this idea of attention is extremely important, because it's easy to think of attention.
That also seems to be the case, that that kind of language, like here I am, is the availability. Like what God is about to put Moses to a task, to a call in his life. And Moses is saying, here I am, I'm ready. I'm ready for this call, right? Again, that's partly because we're comparing literature within the Old Testament. And when people say that, like here I am, then they're ready to be put to the task that God's going to call them to.
And cognition, let's say, or even rationality as somehow equivalent, but they're importantly different, because rationality builds towers of Babel, let's say, and rationality makes presumptions about the world. But attention is a precondition for revelation and for rationality. And attention is in and of itself a kind of openness to the horizon of transformation. And the more, I would say, there's a direct connection between being attentive and even being capable of healing in some real sense. So if you're a clinician, one of the things you learn, and Carl Rogers, the clinician, was a particularly potent writer on this notion that attentive listening in and of itself has a curative capacity. You let people unfold in front of you, or you encourage them to unfold in front of you. And that's not even analytic thought. There can be a strategic component of it, but mostly it's just the devotion of attention. And attention also, in some real sense, sheds light on the darkness, because we only see what we attend to, and what we don't see, or what we don't perceive in the broadest sense, is in some real sense not even there. Well, Rogers talked about this concept he called congruence, and he believed that if you were going to enter into a therapeutic dialogos, because Rogers was basically a Christian seminarian, although he became an agnostic, he was going to go practice as a missionary, and so his thought is is absolutely saturated with Protestant liberal Christian presuppositions. And he believed that in order to engage in a healing conversation, so to actually be able to listen, you had to be congruent. And what he meant by that was that your body and your emotions and your motivations and your rationality and your utterances and the way that you cast your attention were genuinely integrated all the way down. And I think part of the yogic practice, so when you practice yoga, people don't know this generally, but the postures, the asanas, those are more like...
He's all over the place. Like, so this conversation so far is very much all over the place. And I wish somebody else other than Jordan Peterson was moderating this. Because Jordan Peterson has a habit of, as much as I love him, rabbit trailing and starting talking about stuff like yoga. No. Stick to the subject. You guys are reading a text and you're analyzing a text and you're trying to figure out the text. The text has an original audience. It's got an original author. It's got an original purpose. And it's got a bunch of these original things. You have to get those on right before you move on to any other subject. Congruency, this psychologist's view of X subject, this philosopher's view of this and that. You guys, again, here's the thing. I highly doubt Moses sitting there and thinking about yoga and yogic practice. I highly doubt the first audience of this text, the Exodus text, is sitting there and reading this and thinking about yogic practice. This has nothing to do with the text. Zero.
Jordan, can I put it slightly differently, though?
Please, I'm begging you. Yes, I was going to say, I can't wait till Os Guinness comments on this. Dennis Prager and Os Guinness would be the guys that I would really want to hear to comment on this, because this is going somewhere else. And I'm really hoping here that Os Guinness is going to bring us back to the text, back to what's going on.
I agree with everything said. And you're talking about the extraordinary, which we should see in the ordinary. Stephen's exactly right. I agree with everything you said. But here you have the immensity of something quite beyond.
Os Guinness did not say kind of what I said, because I'm analyzing stuff. But in the midst of conversation, I would have approached it differently. And again, this age here, there's wisdom. He said, look, I'm going to approach this differently. I agree with whatever you guys have said, because whatever they've said isn't wrong. My difficulty with it is that what they're saying has nothing to do with the text. Let's talk about the text. And that's what he's doing. He's saying, I agree with what you're saying, but... And then he's going to bring them back. Oh, it's genius.
Normal experience. So we've got to remember, more than half of the world have a belief that comes from this chapter, because this is different from Hinduism. This is different from atheism. This is different from every other religion. And say, people like Rodney Stark, monotheism, properly understood, is the single most powerful idea humans have ever had. Mm-hmm. And I think we've got to keep the immensity of what's happening here. All you said is right, but here it's elevated to an incredible level.
Right. So what do you think specifically differentiates this?
Yes.
Well,
last question.
Verse 14, which we're coming to, amplified by, say, prophets like Isaiah, you have a vision of God here. There's nothing like it. Outside of the cosmos, outside of history, outside of humanity. This is something immensely different. And I think we've got to recognize the radical uniqueness of it.
It's worth pointing out, just on that point, just to back up what Oz just said, there's no hesitation at all over the significance of the burning bush. The bush is a vehicle for divine revelation. What would have been much more common in the religious climate of his time would be to treat the bush as some sort of expression, a form of divinity, actual divinity.
In and of itself.
Yes, just
Okay, so this is actually really good. Now it's hitting on, like, this bush would have become an idol, essentially. Like, it would have been the bush itself. But it's not. It's literally not. It's just a thing. But because God is speaking through the bush, the nearest vicinity to that is now holy. Because the things that make the thing that makes things holy is God. That's so good.
Pointer to something
absolutely,
else.
just as the Egyptians would take, as we'll see later, the snake as something divine, a naturalistic way of understanding divinity. There's no pause there at all. It's immediately Moses is attuned to the transcendent, attuned to God speaking through an inanimate object, or well, an animate object, but just a piece of nature. There's no sense that he's trying to divinize or put sort of ultimate significance in just
That's
in a bush,
good,
as would have been
man.
very
That's
common
so
and has been very common for the sort of across the vast swathe of the history of religious belief.
Well, as part of your point, if I understand it correctly, is that Moses turns to the burning bush, which is a phenomenon that attracts his attention. But then in some sense, and this is to James' point too, he sees through that anomalous event, even though it's anomalous and powerful in its own right. And then he sees something behind that that's the source of that anomalous and interesting event. And then in some sense, this extends to a vision that's beyond the cosmos itself, right? Beyond the confines of time and space itself, to localize the transcendent, not in the natural world, not in the phenomenal world, but beyond all of that. And so that's part of what makes it terrifying and profound simultaneously. That
Well, to press it one further, I mean, Stephen's right. There's a tension, but he wants to know why, an explanation. So that's the signal of transcendence. But when he turns, it's not what he sees. That's where I disagree with you. It's what he hears. And surely that's the significance. You see right from, you've got 3 revelations of God, first to Moses alone, and then to all the elders of Israel, and then to the entire nation, Deuteronomy 4. And it says, you didn't see a form, you only heard a voice. And so it's
So notice how textual Oz is versus other folks, and is closer in regards to his analysis of the text. I think that's very, very important when we do theology, when we're thinking about God, when we're doing biblical analysis. And we're joining these people in a group discussion, I mean, in a virtual format, which is great. So I like this because I think a lot of times our Bible studies in churches look like this, and then there's nobody there like an Os Guinness to say something like, hey, what you guys said isn't wrong, but is that what the text is saying? Is that what this specific text is saying? Right? Like if we're studying a text, let's just say we're studying like Genesis 8, and then somebody says, well, we should love our enemies. My response would be, you're right. The Bible says that very clearly, but what does that have to do with the text we're studying? Because we want to understand this text. Generally, I've realized that people start speaking about things that they're comfortable with and from the various parts of Scripture, and not addressing the text they're studying because they don't have anything to add about the text they're studying. Because they don't know the text they're studying. Then you should be studying it instead of bringing other ideas into the text.
I don't think these are ultimately opposed, though, are they? I mean, if what's being revealed here is as it were, the ultimate order of being itself. God is being revealed as that which is beyond nature, but revealed through these signs that point to that beyond, that which is beyond nature. And this is where we'll see the great distinction between the God of the Israelites and the God of the Egyptians, or as the Egyptians conceive of God as totally bound within the natural. So it's both beyond on the one hand, but signified in what is visual as beyond, but it is at the same time understood through the word.
And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, which are in Egypt. And so he's re-emphasizing the notion that he's attending, and also that he's the spirit that's responding to their intrinsic and embodied desire to be free of slavery, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. All of that's a delineation of the notion that there's something intrinsically and fundamentally unethical about the enslavement of the Israelites. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, away from tyranny, and to bring them out of that land unto a good land and large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now, therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I've also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Okay, so now we have
So this is God ultimately coming to, like, if you've read Genesis, and the assumption here in Exodus is that you've read Genesis. It has to be. So Abraham's call in chapter 12 of Genesis. You know that the family ends up with Jacob being in Egypt because of Joseph and because of the famine. And then it ends there, right? So there's a blessing given, so on and so forth. But there's a promise that God has made to Abraham that is yet to be fulfilled. Number one, they're going to get the land. Number two, their numbers are going to increase. They're going to be like the sand on the sea and the stars in the sky. So these are the words that are now introducing to us. God is about to fulfill his promise, and the faithfulness of God. He's going to fulfill his promise to the Israelites. And